Today we've got a great revenge story of getting the last laugh on a bully. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, Inconsiderate neighbor got his comeuppance. Back in 1993, I was living in a South American country where AC wasn't something people had or needed due to the great year-round weather. But obviously, this meant you just kept windows open for airflow. It kept the apartment cool and with clean air, but the downside was noise levels. While 7 months pregnant in an unusually hot, breezeless Easter week, we started hearing dogs barking like crazy day and night. It went on for days and I'd had it, so I went floor to floor to find where this was coming from, and when I got to the offending apartment, I found a group of angry neighbors knocking on the door of the apartment, which was one of those heavy-duty security doors with metal bars that slide into the top, bottom, and sides when you lock it. Long story short, days go by and the poor dogs continue to bark incessantly, and no one ever answers the door. So I was sick and tired of not sleeping, and I started going up the elevator to his floor and chucking eggs at his door right from the elevator without even needing to come out. After a few more days of this crap, I stepped it up a notch. I took a tube of crazy glue and squirted its contents into the security door's lock. When the guy returned, he had to call the fire department to help him get through to his apartment. As this was a steel door with bars that went into the walls, ceiling, and sides around the door's frame, they had to destroy everything around it to be able to pull out the door because there was no earthly way to get the lock to open. You can only imagine the mess and what it must have cost him to fix the door and surrounding structures. I was at first feeling like I'd gone too far until I got the full scoop. It turned out he went off on Easter vacay for 10 days and had left 2 large dogs chained up in a tiny bathroom with a bunch of food and water. Then I didn't feel so bad. It definitely seems like one of those stories that you hear and you go, oh, maybe they did go too far, until you hear the full extent of the actual situation. Jamarquez 1973 commented, yeah, he deserved far more than an expensive repair bill. I am glad for what he did get though. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy awesome stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is No Smoking Allowed. I owned a duplex and rented out the upper unit. My upstairs tenant had his male cousin staying with him. The cousin was a smoker and I'd previously made my tenant aware that smoking was not allowed because I had non-smoker home insurance. I could smell the smoke every time the cousin lit up, but my tenant denied that anyone was smoking. I had an extra, new in the box, unused smoke detector. Every time I smelled smoke, I would hit the test button on the smoke detector to set it off. After I'd done this a few times on a number of days, I found the cousin sitting outside on the front porch smoking. I would say that you could probably have escalated this and maybe even sought to kick these people out, but at the same time, I guess you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to have to re-clean everything, get it all set back up, have viewings, and try to find another tenant that not only is willing to pay whatever reasonable amount, but this is a duplex situation, somebody you're willing to live close quarters to? Personal Heart 1227 commented, did you boot them both out? I hope so. You had legit grounds to do so too. OP responded saying, the cousin stayed for only a few weeks and my tenant eventually threw him out and changed the locks on his front door without my knowledge. This would later come back to haunt my tenant when his cleaning lady couldn't get into his unit and I couldn't let her in because I didn't have a key to his new lock. Later on, from time to time, there would be mail addressed to the cousin in my mailbox from health organizations which deal with psychiatric illnesses. It is likely that the cousin suffered from schizophrenia, and it's my understanding that many schizophrenic patients are chronic smokers. Our next story is, It's No One's Locker. Not sure if petty, but a good story. I started working at a hospital a few years ago. A majority of the staff is female, and somehow the male lockers by the ICU are used by security. Security used to be by the UIC, but they deactivated the ER and security stay in the front lobby. There were a few not marked or had a lock on them. I took a vacant one. About 2 days later, there's a note on the locker stating, "You unlawfully removed items from this locker. This locker is not assigned to you. Remove your items and lock or the lock will be cut." End quote. I asked myself, how can I make this worse? I found a lawful vacant locker adjacent to my unlawfully conquered locker. Also, I found a lock that wasn't being used. I printed out a meme of Judge Dredd yelling out, "I did not break the law, I am the law." Another meme below of Judas Priest breaking the law, taped both pictures on the locker and locked it with unknown lock. 3 days passed and head of security was asking all male staff who's occupying this locker. No one came forward. She claimed that the security officer's stuff was in there and that it was stolen, etc. My conscience? That's a darn lie and you know it. Head of security asked should the culprit be given more time to come forward. I say, oh, absolutely not. Serve them some justice. Head of security used a bolt cutter and voila, nothing in there. I said, same result as the mystery of Al Capone's vault. Yeah, you know, boss, the same thing happened to Geraldo and his career never recovered. That's definitely a fun one if you get the reference. Helmeted Window Licker commented, typical jerks. It's supposed to be professional, but nope. Always trying to get something for nothing. Wow, this is our workforce today. Our next story is, housemate almost got my phone damaged. Now I'm a nuisance to her. So I stay at a large multi-storied ladies' hostel, and we don't have plug boards in our rooms. Probably because precaution, since there's like 400 of us and someone may plug a straightener or iron box in their room and leave it on and close the room, and no one will know until it's too late. Instead, we have a community plug board with about 15 plug holes in each floor. These plug holes have their own respective switches near each of them. Also, we're Indian, so plug board culture may differ from readers, and a few of those plug holes don't even work, but there's one plug hole that always makes sounds and doesn't work when we plug phones in. So one day, I plugged my phone into charge and went to have breakfast. Later when I returned, my phone was changed from the original plug hole I put it in, and this girl has put hers in the hole I used. Now that would have been okay, but there were plenty of plug holes free, but she chose to take my phone and charger off that particular hole and put in hers. And not only that, she plugged my phone on that faulty sound-making plug hole and had switched it on. My phone wasn't charging obviously, but given the nature of that one plug which makes sounds like small cracklings, my phone could have gotten damaged. I am broke for these people's stupidity. I kept in my mind her phone case color and charger color, so nowadays whenever the girl with the pink phone case, black charger plugs her phone in, I check if someone's around and turn off the switch of the plug hole she plugged it in. I've done it many times now. I'll do it until I feel I've done enough. That tapioca shell can so-and-so with her now always half-charged phone. This is like the advice I heard from Charles Barkley that you don't commit crimes with checks. If you're gonna go and move other people's stuff around so that you can have a better position yourself, you probably don't want to leave behind the property that's going to be able to identify you, or at least allow them to target you back. Coder Joe1 commented, I'm unfamiliar with the tapioca shell saying, but am now hungry for some delicious tapioca pudding. Our next story is Revenge for 2 Bounced Checks. In the late 1970s, I belonged to a Radio Shack TRS-80 computer club and had bought a large quantity of new Epson MX80 and MX100 dot matrix printers, which I sold at a very reasonable price to members of the club. I received a check from one of the members for an MX80 printer, but the check bounced. After notifying the club member, he returned the MX80 and said that he now wanted an MX100 printer, and again paid with a check, which also bounced. He returned the printer. Tired of wasting my time with this member, and now in the possession of 2 used printers, I felt that I should be in some way compensated. So I went to his bank with the bounced check, and the teller told me that there was not sufficient funds in his account. I asked her how much was in the account, and she told me. I then deposited $100 less than the value of the check into the club member's account, and was now able to cash the previously bounced check, which provided me with a payment of $100 for all the trouble this member had caused me. A few weeks later, I received a threatening phone call from the member. He had just gotten his bank statement and saw the large withdrawal for the printer, but failed to notice the deposit that I had made. I told him that our conversation was being recorded and that I was satisfied with receiving $100 for him wasting my time and returning 2 now used printers. I then hung up and never saw or heard from him again. You know, when I just said that thing a second ago about not committing crimes with checks, I wasn't expecting a story to pop up that so accurately kind of reflected that. Consistent Movie 229 commented, I worked in an appliance store in the 90s, and if we got a check back marked not sufficient funds, I would call the bank on each Friday, the 1st, 15th, and 30th of the month, all traditional paydays. If the bank told me there were now funds to cover the check, I would send the owner to that bank's closest branch and have them cash the check. It was always interesting when the check writer would call all upset that we cashed their check. Potatoes Pancakes commented, "Not a lot of people know you can do this. I worked for a bank and we were allowed to say if the people have sufficient or not sufficient funds to cover your check at this moment. We were forbidden to say exactly how much is in there though. I'm not sure if telling a non-account holder the amount was allowed in the 70s. Our next story is Parking Nightmare. I live in a high-rent city where investors plague neighborhoods with modern-day slumlord rentals. In my high-density hood, we have maybe more than 10 people in a house, another few in a coach house, and everyone drives. It's so congested it could take me 20 minutes just to get a few miles onto the freeway. Needless to say, the parking situation is even worse. I have to park blocks away sometimes. Anyway, my neighbor across the street decided to reserve parking spots in front of their house with orange cones. Yesterday, I saw an empty spot where their cones were, so I decided to park there. As I walked away, I see that their cones were chucked into their yard. I thought nothing more of it. This morning, I found fresh key scratches on the passenger side of my door and a handwritten note that says, "If I have a problem with the rules of the street, I am welcome to settle it face to face." I called the police, and they've been making their rounds interviewing other neighbors on the street. I sure hope that they can call the building inspector in. I'm certain they're not allowed to have that many people in a residence. The parking saga continues with no real resolution. If you live in a high-rent city, maybe somebody nearby would have some kind of camera set up somewhere that might have caught something. I mean, I suppose you at least have an idea of who did it so you can at least know kind of what to look out for, or, I don't know, if you want to go full vigilante yourself. Acrobatic Source 3 commented, "Well, you know what their car looks like, right? So instead of settling it face to face, settle it key to car. They better not dish it if they can't take it." Our next story is Let the Garden Grow. A few years back, I was working as a gardener. My contract was to visit elderly folk in their homes to make sure their gardens were safe. This was a government-funded program designed to keep people out of aged care as long as possible. Because the program was government-subsidized, there were a lot of rules and restrictions about what I could and could not do for clients under the model. Now that there's some background, on to the story. One particular couple were particularly demanding and ungrateful for the 2 years that I was looking after their property. The wife would stand and try to micromanage me trimming their hedges or mowing their lawns. The husband was a stepping stone for his wife, and I felt genuinely sorry for the guy. This woman would always ask me to do things outside the scope of the program, i.e., purely ornamental jobs, landscaping, tree removal, etc., that take more time than I was allotted to give. I once did an extra job for them, taking half a day, and after agreeing on a price beforehand, she tried to argue the price cheaper when she was paying. I didn't take any further extra work from them, but a few times when I would come back, they had a fresh migrant in the garden doing some serious hard labor. I asked him how much they were paying him, and it was less than 50% of the going rate. Frustrated that they were not only trying to manipulate a government program for their benefit, but also abusing a migrant who doesn't know any better, they migrated themselves some 50 years ago. I figured I would actually give them some work to give out to people. I threw hundreds of cannabis seeds around their garden. Every bed, behind every shed, amongst the fruit trees, and into every nook and cranny that a plant could possibly grow. I figure either they would pay someone to pull all the plants out, or they could let it grow and use some to chill the freak out. I guess as long as they certainly can't track that back down to OP, it's a kind of a good revenge. Hey, maybe OP found and provided the one thing that was lacking for these people in their lives that they needed that wasn't provided by the government benefits or subsidies. A little green time. Kinsfire commented, "Probably a couple who had gamed the system as hard as they possibly could to get the benefit. It's the reason that BCFI exists in New York City. Bureau of Client Fraud Investigations, Welfare. There were people who knew exactly how to game the system. Someone I know worked with someone who got a fraudster who was paying the rent in Trump Tower, back when that meant something, off their ill-gotten gains. It invariably involves the person finding a way to open multiple welfare claims. The guy I know tracked one guy down who had literally $1 million a year things set up. Problem was at that time, if they up and headed to a new county to pull their crap, the county they left couldn't go after them. So move from New York City to Nassau County and do it in Nassau. Then move back to New York City when the heat's off. Our next story is cigarette butt revenge. I owned a duplex and lived in one of the 2 units. I rented out the other unit. The tenants in that unit had a guest who smoked, and they only allowed him to smoke on the front porch, where after smoking, he threw his cigarette butts onto the porch and onto the front lawn. After discovering this, I picked up the large number of butts and positioned each one vertically on the front porch like a minefield, which couldn't be avoided when they entered or exited their front door. The result: no more cigarette butts on the front porch or lawn. It's like one of those dog or cat videos you see all the time on TikTok where they arrange a bunch of pens or soda cans in a row, and it just progressively keeps getting higher and bigger and seeing if the dog can manage to work their way through there without just knocking everything over. I guess when it's a little bit more in your way, you might actually take those 30 seconds to just dispose of it properly. MMPJD commented, I had a similar situation a few years ago. Neighbors were using a portion of their large home as an Airbnb. One of their guests would toss their butts onto my driveway, but I could never seem to catch them in the act. I gathered all the butts and deposited them into their mailbox. That was the end of that. Our next story is Baseball Mailbox Level 9999. Grew up in the country, driveway so long and so much woodland between it and the mailbox you could barely hear the road, let alone see the mailbox. Any mailbox out of sight of the house on that road was always getting destroyed. So my dad asked if he could have an old steel drum from a friend of his, or so I was told. I was a kid, and he also got a square column of wood and affixed a crosspiece to support the weight of the mailbox constructed from the steel drum. The metal must be half an inch thick, and the wooden pillar is at least 6 inches on each side and 3 feet high, with who knows how much buried underground, probably with a cement anchor. My mom painted our house number and the family name calligraphy style on the drum after spraying it with a rust-proof black protective layer inside and out. The door to the mailbox and the red flag were also made out of steel and affixed with massive bolts. The mailbox seemed as though it were impervious to any issues since. Although sometime later we did find out that there was a sliver of metal missing from one side of it. It seemed as though someone tried to take an axe to it, made it a half a millimeter deep perhaps, and probably made them go home to rethink their life. Years later, a delivery truck actually full-on hit it. It was placed at the bottom of a blind hill that was also a curve, narrow road with no shoulder, so accidents happened at the end of our driveway a lot, and pushed 30 feet from its position. Post didn't even break except maybe at the cement anchor. Mailbox is still there, nearly 40 years later. The important thing is they live out in the country where there probably isn't a lot of regulation on something like this. I heard a lot of stories about similar things where people would be going around with baseball bats and knocking off mailboxes, and people would want to build these incredibly overblown, reinforced, over-engineered mail receptacles, but there would actually be laws or regulations that say you can't do that because it's dangerous if a car crashes into it. Or the classic thing, HOA. Love My Bee commented, a woman I used to play cards with told us a story once. This was way back in the day when we all had metal trash cans. Apparently, she had a neighbor kid who kicked over people's trash cans on pickup day. So she had a pool put in her backyard. The pool company left a small amount of wood and concrete powder behind. So she swept it up and put it in the trash can and put it out on the curb for pickup. I hope you can imagine how heavy and dense this small can was. The kid came along and kicked it and broke his leg. His parents tried to sue her, but that was shut down pretty quickly by neighbors who had their trash cans kicked over in the previous weeks. Pretty satisfying story, even secondhand. Our next story is petty revenge against a group of entitled people. This takes place back in 1971. It was Christmas Eve, and I was 18 working with a friend I just graduated high school with that year. We worked in a gas station pumping gas in New Jersey. It had been snowing all day, and there was about 4 inches or more on the ground. The station was on US Route 46 eastbound, about 10 miles from New York City. This is a 2-lane road in each direction with simple metal guardrails separating the east and west lanes. The owner of the station said we were not to do service calls as he was not insured for it. So, around 8 p.m., we see this guy crossing the eastbound lanes, hop the guardrail, and walk into the station. This guy was dressed in very nice clothes. He told us he had a flat and asked if we could fix it for him. My friend Mark said that we were not allowed to leave the station. The guy started to beg us to please help them as they had a Christmas party to get to in New York City. I asked Mark if we should help the guy, and Mark said, "If you want to do it, then go ahead." I asked him how much to charge, and he said $5. So the guy agreed, and I threw a floor jack in my trunk and we went over to his car. It was right across the highway in the entrance to a large car dealership. When I got out of the car, there were 5 other people there, all dressed in fine outfits. They reeked money. It was 3 couples. One woman started saying things like, "Thank you, you're a lifesaver," and such. One of the men said something I did not quite understand to the one who came to the station. He said, "How much?" The guy replied, "A Finsky." Now, I'd never heard this word, but I knew that Fin was slang for $5, so I assumed that's what it was referring to. Well, then it happened. They stopped conversing in English and switched to German. This is where it gets interesting. As I mentioned, I had graduated high school about 6 months earlier after having had 4 years of B-level German, so I understood quite a bit of what they were saying. Basically, the conversation went like, "This is crazy, it's too much. You could go down the street and pay half that much." Now, you might say, why are they complaining about $5? I just looked it up, and $5 in 1971 is over $38 today. So yes, for that time it was expensive, so I keep my mouth shut and do my work just listening to conversation. I didn't know any German curse words, which was good for them because I would have stopped and left them there on the spot. I finished changing the tire and put everything away. They're still jabbering in German. I had decided what to do and very politely tapped the guy on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, but can I have my $5 now?" In German. That resulted in complete silence from all of them. 6 people stared at me in shock, and it was like you could see them shrink into themselves as they realized I understood what they were saying. The woman who said "you're a lifesaver" said in English, "Oh, you understand German?" I replied to her in German saying, "Yes, I do." I could tell that they were all very flustered about it. She asked me in English how to get to New York City, and I gave her the directions in German. I wanted to twist the knife, so to speak, to push home how much German I understood. They paid me, and as they were driving away, the woman was sitting in the back seat looking out the window staring at me as they drove away. I was on cloud 9. I felt like I was hovering above the ground. I just cut 6 snooty entitled people off at the knees and did it by being polite with a smile on my face. It was glorious. I've said it before in the past, but I love stories like these. Situations where people think, "Oh, you don't speak my language," and they just blab off the utter truth like they got hit by a truth serum syringe, only to find out that they've been spilling the truth directly to that person. Bill Evans at Mariposa commented, "I was a substitute teacher in Irvine, California. In one class, there were a bunch of jocks and cheerleader types sitting in the front row. The jocks were lobbing insults in my general direction in German to impress the girls. I just stood there until they became aware that I was focused on them. I said, 'I don't understand German at all,' in German. Their faces got kinda sheepish." Our next story is one of my prouder moments. The guy I was engaged to started acting differently. Come to find out, he was seeing someone in Dallas. Rumor had it they were up to no good selling drugs. They told everyone to stay away from the house because the law was watching the house, since there was so much traffic going in and out. Back then, you can put an ad in the newspaper and just be billed for it. I put a 10-day ad in the newspaper saying, "Estate sale, early birds welcome, everything must go." That was such a great feeling to do that. I was told people showed up as early as 5 a.m. Hey, I honestly see this one of 2 ways. Either you help the cops complete their job and get a little bit of more justice, get some stuff off the streets, or you probably help them be at least a little bit more respectable for at least 10 days. Faceless Artifact commented, "Were they arrested? Did this help them get even more well-known as a drug house? Excellent revenge." OP responded saying they were under investigation at the time. A year or so later, they were both picked up in a conspiracy charge. He ended up with around 33 years in prison, and the girlfriend got 10 years federal. He signed statements on her that caused her to get 10 years. The upside is the girl ended up being one of my favorite friends in the world. We're still close friends. Our next story is got the last laugh with a bully. This is an old story from my childhood. I, 26 non-binary, was undiagnosed autistic growing up. Boomer parents didn't believe in mental health/ND interventions, so I just raw dogged my way through life until I got diagnosed at 24. This story takes place when I was 10. I moved all around the world growing up. When I was 8, my family moved to Japan and we stayed there for 4 years. Being undiagnosed meant that I was socially ostracized and bullied constantly for being a weirdo. Add in early childhood trauma, and it made relating to my age group really difficult. So most of my friends were the adults in my life, librarians, admin, coaches, etc. There was a girl I lived by who was a year ahead of me in school, and we would hang out sometimes because options were slim. One day we went for a walk in this wooded area near my house. She lived in an apartment building, important context. She began to bully me, which had happened a few times before, but I genuinely couldn't tell. Always thought she was laughing with me, not at me. Anyways, that day she got really nasty and made me cry. I used to be very shy, quiet, and much like a doormat. I didn't know how to stand up for myself, so rather than stick up for myself, I just walked away and went home. I was really angry and upset though and wanted to get her back. As I mentioned, she lived in an apartment building. It just so happens that she parked her new bike in front of the building out in the open. There was a communal dumpster behind the building. You see where this is going. I spent an hour at home and then walked to her building 5 minutes away at most. I saw her bike. I was a tall, strong, athletic kid, so picking up a bike wasn't hard for me. I took her bike and buried it towards the bottom of the dumpster, then walked back home. Few hours later, her parents came by my house to talk to my parents. Turns out there were security cameras that caught me in the act that I didn't see. By that time though, trash had been picked up and her bike was gone. She never bullied me again, and my parents still think it was freaking hilarious to this day. I wasn't great with words for defending myself, but man, am I proud of 10-year-old me's actions. If I could go back in time, I would have done it again. Such a little crap. Well, at least it sounds like OP's getting things figured out and getting their life under control now. Just gotta say, if you're committing crimes, A, don't do it with checks. B, look out for security cameras. Background Nerd commented, I hate to tell you this, but being diagnosed would not have cut down on the bullying. Once diagnosed, all my past problems made sense, but I still would have had the same problems. Our next story is it sawdust or cornmeal? In high school, I was one of 4 girls in FFA, Future Farmers of America. We knew where the cute guys were. The teacher didn't like females in the class, as it's geared towards men and farming. We were building jewelry boxes in the shop when the teacher came in with a bunch of Rocky Mountain oysters, bowl balls. Since the teacher thought females belong in the kitchen, we were told to prepare them for frying. Not something I wanted to even touch. The sawdust and the cornmeal we were told to use looked just alike. So I rolled the bowl balls in the sawdust. I never mentioned it for over 20 years, and I confessed on Facebook. People definitely remembered that lunch. It was actually shocking how many people did remember. They weren't mad, they found it funny. Not sure I would have been such a good sport. Nah, I would have laughed and figured out a way to outdo the prank. Great times. Yeah, I just don't think I'm ever going to be getting in line to eat any Rocky Mountain oysters or sawdust. Campfires and Conifers commented, my dad's high school had a FFA. This is about 1952, but the girls couldn't be in it because they had to take home ec, cooking and sewing. My dad said he and a bunch of the other boys brought up at a school board meeting how stupid this was. Some of the boys wanted to know how to cook, and some of the girls wanted to know how to farm. Keep in mind that in 1952, a lot of the family farms in the US were being solely run by women because a lot of husbands, brothers, uncles, etc. had been killed or disabled during World War II. The argument that women can't farm was nuts because almost all the women ran the farms by themselves during the war, and of course, many continued to do so afterwards, and of course there were lots of men in the community who cooked for themselves because either there wasn't a woman available to cook for them, or, gasp, they enjoyed cooking. My dad said the school board went feral over the idea. He said you'd have thought the kids had suggested a public orgy or something. Absolutely not was the final answer. He was really happy when the rules changed, but it was long after he was an adult. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely awesome revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.